Hi, my name is Korede and I am a podcaster. This is Podcast Stories, where I talk about my experience making podcasts. Right now, I am taking a look at season 3 of I Am Change podcast. Last week, I talked about my podcast episode with Hamzat Lawal, aka Hamzi Code. And this week, I am going to be talking about my podcast episode with Alhan Islam.
For I say that violence has no religion. Violence has no religion. I repeat that 3 times. Violence has no religion.
So I knew I wanted to talk to Alhan, but the problem was, how do I get her on this podcast? Lucky for me, I had a friend who knew her and she gave me her contact details. So I talked with Alhan about getting on the podcast, and from day one, I absolutely loved her. She was so sweet, her energy was on point, and I thought to myself, yes, jackpot. But that was not the end. So the day of the interview came, and I waited and waited and waited. Great people are busy. Anyway, I finally got to talk to her, and it turned out that she had been driving. She was so apologetic. She wanted to park and, so she could do the interview with me, but I had to be considerate. Obviously, it wasn't a good time for her, and I needed her to be comfortable when doing the podcast. I mean, it was the least I could do for someone who was giving me 30 minutes of her time. That's a big deal. So we rescheduled the interview. The day of the second interview came, and guess what? It was perfect. Whew. Alhan Islam was such a great guest to have. I had an amazing time talking to her about the power of words. You should definitely listen to this episode. Search for I Am Change podcast with Alhan Islam on your favorite podcast listening app. The podcast is on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, etc., etc. You can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at I Am Change Pod. We always post updates, so yeah, you always know what's happening. I would love to hear your feedback when you listen to the episode, so please leave a review or leave a comment on whatever podcast app you're using to listen. It would be fantastic to hear from you. So that's it on this episode of Podcast Stories with Korede. Thank you so much for watching. Ciao. Seeing as you started young, was there any point where you felt maybe nervous or shy about putting yourself out there and putting your work out there, and maybe even a bit afraid that you might get some negative feedback?
I think almost, if not all the time, I do feel that way. But again, if it doesn't make you afraid, it's not worth it, and you just have to do it afraid.